From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here with Joe Sternberg and Kim Strassel. And just one more quick question, Joe Sternberg here on the Durham mess. Do you see any self-reflection on the part of our media brethren who flogged the collusion theory so relentlessly, including the Steele Dossier? Any sense that, geez, maybe we messed this one up?
No, you're not seeing that. And I think that this is another big problem in terms of institutional credibility in American politics right now, because I think that a lot of our peers in the media were very enthusiastic about these stories, partly because they fed into a lot of the negative things that many journalists were predisposed to want to believe about President Trump before and during his administration. And so there was always this sense that some of these stories, as implausible as they sounded when you would hear the details of them come out, somehow were still perceived as being too good to check. And unfortunately, I don't see any sign that that attitude is changing. And part of the problem might be that the falsehoods in the Steele Dossier and some of these other things were so outrageous that now it would be deeply embarrassing for a lot of people in the media to have to admit that they were taken in by that at some point.
I agree with you on that deeply embarrassing point. But on the other hand, it would be nice, I think, if there was some self-reflection, maybe it would enhance the credibility of the press. Because right now, I think tens of millions of Americans just don't believe what they read in the mainstream publications that were flogging this. Means the New York Times, the Washington Post, so many others. All right, thank you. Let's talk about the UK fiasco. And if you think American politics is a mess, we've got nothing on the UK and the Tories, who are have been staging over now many months an implosion for the ages. Under Boris Johnson, the previous prime minister, they won a historic election majority, I think, Joe, more than 80 seats. But he pursued policies that on energy and on a variety of other things that have led to enormous price increases, enormous inflation, 40-year highs in inflation like the United States. But the Central Bank of England, has not been as quick to try to rein it in. So Boris, with a couple of other scandals related to the pandemic, he gets thrown out. They then spend months picking a new prime minister. They choose Liz Truss over Rishi Sunak, the chancellor of the exchequer under Boris. She campaigns on a tax cut. She announces the tax cut, her new chancellor does. And within 3 weeks, the Tories are sticking the knives in her, and she sacked Mr. Kwasi Kwarteng, her former chancellor, and now she is named Jeremy Hunt, a new one who has proceeded to essentially repudiate what his predecessor announced only 3 weeks ago. Let's listen to Hunt explain why he's giving up on individual tax cuts and the corporate tax cut.
The government's current plan is to cut the basic rate of income tax to 19% from April 2023. But at a time when markets are rightly demanding commitment to sustainable public finances, it is not right to borrow to fund this tax cut. So I've decided that the basic rate of income tax will remain at 20%, and it will do so indefinitely until economic circumstances allow for it to be cut. No government can control markets, but every government can give certainty about the sustainability of public finances. And that is one of the many factors that influence how markets behave. And for that reason, although the Prime Minister and I are both committed to cutting corporation tax, on Friday she listened to concerns about the mini-budget and confirmed we will not proceed with the cut to corporation tax announced.
Joe, the repudiation by Hunt, his prime minister's agenda, is one for the record books. I can't recall something like it.
It has been an extraordinary few weeks, and I think that there are a bunch of things going on here to unpack that explain why this is such a bad moment for the UK. I mean, one point is what's been going on in the markets, and this is something that I think people in the US also need to pay attention to. The underlying phenomenon here is that the UK, like the US, had been in an environment for the past 15 years where the central bank had been holding interest rates abnormally extremely low, very near zero for much of that time. And the economy had adjusted. You had had a huge run up in house prices and also in people's mortgage borrowing to buy these houses at higher prices. You had a lot of financial and fund managers, pension funds had configured all of their investments about low interest rates. So I think that a big part of the story, that the wall that Liz Truss ran into here, is that the economy was always going to struggle to adapt to raising interest rates to fight the inflation that we're now seeing. And it turned out that they were so skittish about that process in general that it only took one tax cut policy announcement from the government to really set everyone off to the races. And so I think that this partly is a morality tale about how that kind of economic overhang that we've got from the past 15 years means it really makes it difficult for policymakers to put through even pro-growth economic policies like the original Truss plan. And then that just compounded the tendency of a lot of conservatives within the Tory party to lose their nerve because they were never really on board with this procedure anyway. A lot of the conservative members of parliament did not support Liz Truss when she was running for the leadership. They were never really enthusiastic about this agenda. They were much more invested in Boris Johnson's form of big government conservatism. And so I think that she was always going to have faced a difficult slog. And unfortunately, she just hasn't been able to make the case quickly enough to keep this agenda pushing forward.
No question that rollout was done poorly in that it didn't have a lot of preparation. There was no real briefings of the members, no real preparation for why they were doing it other than the statement by the former chancellor. But the debate, Joe, seems to be down to whether or not the tax cuts themselves triggered the meltdown in markets for the rise in yields for the British bonds and the decline in the pound, or was it that triggered by the problems with British pension funds, their stability, as interest rates rose, and they had made some bad bets on some financial instruments to get higher returns. That came a cropper when rates rose, and that's the reason markets melted down.
Yes, and I think that the short answer is that it can be a bit of both. I mean, what we have discovered from this episode is that the pension funds were very, very exposed to increases in interest rates because, as you note, in the long period of very low interest rates, they had pursued a bunch of hedging and other investment strategies that really run into trouble very quickly the higher rates go. And the reality is that rates were going to increase eventually anyway because the central bank really needs to start fighting inflation more aggressively. So I think that the reality is that if it hadn't been markets getting a little bit spooked when this tax cut announcement came out and then things spiraling out of control from there, there would have been some other trigger sooner rather than later. But I think that the problem that Truss has is that you don't really get any credit for that kind of hypothetical in politics. And the reality is that, there was a little bit of a market hiccup the day that they announced the tax cut plan, and that was enough to set in motion this problem with the pension plan. And now the conservatives are getting the political blame for that, whether or not they deserve it. And her political problem is that she and former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng didn't have an answer for that. They weren't getting out there very aggressively explaining to the public what had happened, even though privately they seemed to have a pretty good handle on exactly what the situation was there. And that cleared the field for all of their critics to try to take control of the storytelling around this event.
Right. And Kim, of course, the echoes in the United States where Joe Biden, Gina Raimondo, and others have piled on because they are opposed to any kind of tax cutting to increase the incentives to invest and save and work. So there's an attempt here to analogize Truss's program to anything that would be proposed here. And I think one thing that this shows to me is the degree to which there is simply an enormous consensus in the media and among elite institutions that is hostile to pro-growth economics. Their model of growth economics, I mean, they say they like growth, but the model of growth they pursue is just more spending. It's the Biden plan. It's the Boris Johnson big government conservative plan, spending money on infrastructure, spending money on energy, spending money on any number of things, even as you raise taxes to supposedly pay for it. And we see what has happened in the UK. They have a high tax, high inflation, low productivity economy there. And here in the United States, we have a high inflation, mediocre growth, low productivity economy.
Yeah, and this is why I'm so glad you and Joe just ran through that distinction, which is so important about what are we really seeing in the markets here? Because to me, I think it's not entirely clear, and it could be a little combination of a number of things. The degree to which almost the entirety of the press corps, and then politicians who were opposed to Truss's plan, like Jeremy Hunt, now the Biden administration, are all using this, co-opting it, as it were, to make their argument that any kind of pro-growth policies are bad, that Keynesian spending is basically the only way forward in terms of an economic model. I was really shocked, or maybe I shouldn't be anymore, that Joe Biden came out. I mean, talk about being a friend, and laid into the Truss plan, said it was a mistake, said that it risked other countries being able to pursue sound policy, really using this for his own political benefit to argue that his giant spending packages are the way forward, when in fact, all the evidence is that they are a big source of the inflation that we're seeing today, and that to the extent that the United States is struggling and will struggle to get out of this mess and to avoid stagflation is because we also have governments that are refusing to do those kind of pro-growth policies, which are to really sort of work on the supply side of this by getting out of the way, tearing down some regulations, giving businesses more incentive to invest. So there's just a giant attempt to use this moment in the UK to solidify a broader liberal narrative about policy, and we need to push back on that.
Yeah, I think the Tories have dug themselves a very deep hole politically, and who knows if they'll be able to climb out of it in the 2 years they have left before an election must be called. But right now, they would get crushed by Labor. All right, we'll leave that there, and want to thank Joe and Kim. Thank you all for listening. Remember, you can catch us every day now on your favorite podcast purveyor, so please subscribe. And don't forget to catch Jerry Baker and his Free Expression podcast, also on your favorite platform. And you can send emails to us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. Look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for listening.